The judge's mistake. Judge Robert Calloway prided himself on being a man of the law. He had spent over 20 years on the bench, earning a reputation for being strict, unwavering, and, some whispered, a little arrogant. He ruled his courtroom with an iron fist and rarely let anyone challenge his authority. So, when a woman walked into his courtroom late one Wednesday afternoon, wearing a simple gray dress and carrying a small leather briefcase, he barely glanced at her. He was in a rush, hoping to finish the last case of the day quickly. The woman, a tall, dark-skinned lady with sharp eyes and a confident posture, approached the bench and said firmly, "Your Honor, I'd like to speak regarding this case before we proceed." Calloway sighed dramatically, adjusting his glasses as he looked her over. "And you are?" "Agent Lisa Carter, FBI." At that, Calloway chuckled. A deep, amused laugh echoed through the courtroom. A few spectators exchanged glances, sensing something was off, but the judge didn't seem to notice. "FBI? Really?" He leaned forward slightly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's a good one. And I suppose you're here to, what? Arrest me?" A few people in the gallery chuckled nervously, but Lisa remained unfazed. She pulled out her badge and placed it firmly on the table in front of him. The shiny golden letters read, "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Special Agent Lisa Carter." The laughter stopped. Judge Calloway frowned, adjusting his glasses again as he leaned forward to inspect the badge. His face twitched slightly as he read the identification number and saw the official FBI seal. He cleared his throat. "Well, Agent Carter. What is it that brings you here?" His tone had shifted from arrogance to caution. Lisa didn't smile. "I'm here because this trial involves a defendant under active federal investigation. Your Honor, this court has been handling the case as a minor assault charge. However, we have reason to believe the defendant, Mr. Brian Knox, is involved in a much larger operation. My team has been building a case against him for months." Calloway straightened up in his seat. I wasn't informed of any federal involvement in this matter." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "That's because you never checked. If you had taken a moment to look at the full case file instead of rushing through, you'd have seen that the Department of Justice has flagged Mr. Knox as a person of interest. We need him in federal custody immediately." Murmurs spread through the courtroom. The defendant, a smug-looking man in his early 40s, suddenly seemed less confident. His lawyer whispered something into his ear, but Knox's eyes were locked on Lisa Carter. Calloway, clearly embarrassed, shuffled his papers. "I see. Well, in that case, I suppose we should." Lisa didn't let him finish. She turned to the two uniformed officers in the room. "Deputies, please remand Mr. Knox into federal custody. He is no longer under this court's jurisdiction." The officers hesitated for only a second before stepping toward Knox. The defendant shot a desperate look at the judge. "Your Honor, you can't let them take me. This is ridiculous." Calloway sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mr. Knox, I suggest you remain silent. This court will comply with federal authority." Lisa gave the judge a long, unreadable look before picking up her badge and briefcase. As she turned to leave, she paused, just long enough to say, "Next time, Your Honor, I suggest you take a woman's word seriously, regardless of what she looks like." Then, with a cool, confident stride, she exited the courtroom. For the first time in years, Judge Calloway found himself at a complete loss for words. For the rest of the evening, Judge Calloway couldn't shake the humiliation he had suffered in his own courtroom. The way Agent Carter had put him in his place, so effortlessly, so publicly, left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had spent decades commanding respect, yet in just a few minutes, a woman he had foolishly underestimated had completely overpowered him. That night, he sat in his dimly lit study, swirling a glass of whiskey, replaying the moment over and over. He had laughed at her in front of the entire courtroom, and she had turned the tables without breaking a sweat. A knock at the door startled him. Frowning, he set down his glass and made his way to the entrance of his grand suburban home. Peering through the peephole, he felt his stomach drop. Lisa Carter. She stood there in the same gray dress, her expression unreadable, her posture just as poised as it had been in the courtroom. Judge Calloway hesitated, then unlocked the door and opened it slightly. "Agent Carter, this is unexpected." She didn't smile. "I need to talk to you." For a moment, he considered shutting the door in her face. But something in her eyes made him pause. With a sigh, he stepped aside. "Come in." Lisa entered, glancing around the well-furnished home before turning back to him. "You have no idea who Brian Knox really is, do you?" Calloway folded his arms. "He was just some low-level thug, from what I read." Lisa exhaled sharply. "That's exactly the problem, Judge. You didn't read enough. Knox is the key to one of the biggest organized crime operations on the East Coast. Drug trafficking, arms deals, human smuggling, you name it. And someone in the judicial system has been helping him stay out of federal custody for years." Calloway frowned. "Are you accusing me of something, Agent Carter?" She studied him carefully. "I don't know. Are you involved?" The question stung. "Of course not." Lisa nodded, as if she had expected the answer. "Good. Then you'll want to listen carefully." She pulled out a thin folder from her briefcase and placed it on his coffee table. "We have evidence that someone in the court system has been leaking information to Knox's associates. That's how he's managed to avoid serious federal charges for so long. Every time we built a case, it fell apart before we could act." Calloway slowly sat down, running a hand through his graying hair. "You think it's someone in my court?" Lisa's silence was answer enough. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. "This is unbelievable." "No, Judge," Lisa said, taking a seat across from him. "What's unbelievable is that you laughed at me today instead of taking me seriously. What's unbelievable is that men like Knox continue to slip through the cracks because people in power don't do their jobs properly." Calloway clenched his jaw. He had never been spoken to like this, certainly not in his own home. But he also knew she was right. "How can I help?" he asked finally. Lisa leaned forward. "You can start by keeping your mouth shut. From now on, you don't make any sudden moves. If someone in your court is working for Knox, they'll be watching you closely." Calloway nodded slowly. He had always thought of himself as an untouchable figure, a man who controlled his courtroom with absolute authority. But now, sitting across from Agent Carter, he realized he was just another piece on the board. And he had no choice but to play the game. Judge Calloway barely slept that night. His mind churned with Lisa Carter's words. Someone in his court was leaking information to a criminal network. Someone close to him. He had always thought of himself as a man above corruption, but now, he wasn't so sure. By morning, he had made up his mind, he had to find out who it was. A dangerous proposition. At exactly 8 a.m., Calloway arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual. The hallways were quiet, the only sounds coming from distant conversations and the clicking of heels on polished marble. He strode into his chambers and locked the door behind him. He sat at his desk, staring at the names of the people who had access to sensitive case files, his clerks, the court officers, even some defense attorneys who had gained his trust over the years. One of them was a traitor. A sharp knock at his door made him jump. He took a deep breath and called out, "Come in." The door opened, and to his surprise, Lisa Carter stepped inside. She was dressed in a crisp black suit today, looking even more professional than the day before. She closed the door behind her. "I have news," she said without preamble. Calloway gestured for her to sit, but she remained standing. "We intercepted a call last night. One of Knox's men was in contact with someone from this courthouse. We don't have a name yet, but we're close." Calloway nodded. "How do we catch them?" Lisa's expression darkened. "We set a trap." The setup. That afternoon, Calloway took his usual place on the bench, presiding over routine hearings. But behind the scenes, Lisa's team had planted false information in the courthouse database, an official-looking memo stating that Brian Knox was being transferred to a high-security federal prison in 2 days. If there was a leak, the criminals would react. And they did. That night, Lisa's surveillance team intercepted another call. Someone from the courthouse had informed Knox's people about the transfer and advised them to act fast. The betrayal. The next morning, Lisa stormed into Calloway's chambers, her phone in hand. "We got them." She placed the phone on his desk and hit play. A grainy recording crackled to life. A male voice whispered urgently, "They're moving him in 2 days. We need to make a move before then." Lisa paused the audio. "That voice belong to anyone you know?" Calloway felt a cold wave wash over him. The voice was unmistakable. It was Robert Delgado, his own senior court clerk. A man he had trusted for 15 years. Calloway's hands tightened into fists. "That son of a..." Lisa cut him off. "We need him alive. He's our link to Knox's operation." Calloway exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay calm. "What's the plan?" Lisa's lips curled into a determined smirk. "We let him think he got away with it, and then we reel him in. The sting operation." The next day, Delgado continued working as if nothing had happened. But what he didn't know was that Lisa and her team were watching his every move. At 6 p.m., after the courthouse had emptied, Delgado slipped into his office and made another call. "Everything's set," he muttered. "Just be ready." Lisa, listening through a live feed, gave the signal. Within seconds, FBI agents swarmed the building, surrounding Delgado's office. The moment he realized he had been caught, Delgado tried to run, but 2 agents tackled him before he reached the door. Calloway stood in the hallway, watching as Delgado was dragged away in handcuffs. His once loyal clerk locked eyes with him, his face twisted in betrayal. "Judge, please. I didn't have a choice," Delgado pleaded. Calloway shook his head. "Neither do I." The aftermath. 2 days later, Brian Knox was officially transferred to federal custody, not as a common criminal, but as the leader of a vast criminal empire. Delgado, under the pressure of a long prison sentence, agreed to turn informant, spilling everything he knew about the corruption within the system. As for Calloway, he sat in his chambers that evening, reflecting on everything that had happened. He had always believed he was untouchable, that his courtroom was a place of order and justice. But he had been blind. He had almost let a dangerous criminal slip through his fingers, simply because he had refused to take Lisa Carter seriously. A knock at the door. "Come in," he said, already knowing who it would be. Lisa stepped inside, arms crossed. "You did good, Judge." Calloway smirked. I suppose I owe you an apology. She raised an eyebrow. For what? Laughing at me? Ignoring me? Underestimating me? He sighed. All of the above. Lisa chuckled, finally allowing a small smile. I'll accept your apology, on one condition. Calloway leaned back in his chair. What's that? Lisa's eyes glinted. Next time the FBI comes into your courtroom, don't laugh. Just listen. Calloway chuckled. Deal. And for the first time in his career, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he still had a thing or two to learn. Weeks passed since Robert Delgado's arrest, but Judge Calloway couldn't shake the feeling that this case wasn't truly over. Sure, Delgado had flipped, giving the FBI enough intel to dismantle parts of Brian Knox's operation, but something still felt off. Knox had been too calm during his arraignment. Too sure of himself. Even as the charges stacked against him, he never showed fear. And that terrified Calloway. A sudden twist. One evening, just as Calloway was finishing paperwork in his chambers, his phone rang. He didn't recognize the number. Judge Calloway speaking. Silence. Then a low, smooth voice. Your Honor, I was hoping we could have a little chat. Calloway's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? A soft chuckle. Come now, Judge. You know exactly who I am. Brian Knox. Calloway's pulse quickened, but he kept his voice steady. You have some nerve calling me. I have some nerve? Judge, you hurt my feelings. After all, I thought we had an understanding. But then you went and got my guy arrested. Your guy was a corrupt clerk selling out the justice system. Tomato, tomato, Knox said smoothly. Listen, I wanted to do you a favor. You and I both know that putting me in prison doesn't mean the game is over. I still have friends. And some of them, well, they think you've been a little too involved. Calloway felt a chill run down his spine. Knox sighed theatrically. But lucky for you, I'm a reasonable man. You stay out of this, and I'll make sure they stay out of your way. No accidents. No threats to that nice little home of yours. No unexpected visits. It was a warning. A threat disguised as a courtesy. Calloway's jaw clenched. You think I'm scared of you? Knox laughed. Oh, Judge. I know you are. Click. The line went dead. A tough decision. Calloway sat there for a long time, staring at the silent phone. He had spent decades upholding the law, but this was the first time he truly felt vulnerable. Knox still had power. Even behind bars, he had people on the outside willing to do his bidding. He could go to the police. But what if Knox had connections there, too? Delgado had already proven that corruption ran deep. He could step back, pretend this wasn't his fight. But then he'd be exactly what Lisa Carter had accused him of being, a man who ignored the truth until it was too late. A knock at the door. Come in, he called, his voice rougher than usual. Lisa Carter walked in, holding a file. You look like hell. He let out a dry chuckle. Thanks. She sat down across from him, setting the file on his desk. I have a feeling I know why. Calloway raised an eyebrow. Knox? Lisa nodded. We intercepted a call from one of his men. Sounds like they're planning something. A message for the people who betrayed them. Calloway exhaled sharply. And I'm on that list. Lisa's expression was unreadable. You could walk away, you know. No one would blame you. You did your part. Calloway met her gaze. And let him win? Lisa smirked. I was hoping you'd say that. She pushed the file toward him. Knox thinks he still has control. He thinks he can manipulate the system. But we just found something that might change the game. Calloway opened the file, and what he saw made his breath catch. It was a photograph. A grainy surveillance image. A high-ranking federal judge shaking hands with one of Knox's men. Calloway looked up at Lisa, realization dawning in his eyes. This goes higher than we thought, doesn't it? Lisa nodded. Much higher. Calloway closed the file, his decision made. He wasn't backing down. Judge Calloway sat in his chambers long after Lisa Carter left, staring at the surveillance photo. A federal judge shaking hands with a known associate of Brian Knox. This wasn't just about a corrupt court clerk. This was bigger. And if Knox had a federal judge in his pocket, Calloway was in deeper trouble than he realized. A silent enemy. The next morning, Calloway entered his courtroom with the same confidence he always carried, but inside, he felt like a man walking across thin ice. Who could he trust? The bailiffs? The prosecutors? The other judges? If Knox had someone at the federal level, then there was no telling how far the corruption went. As he sat down, his assistant clerk, Marissa Cole, placed the morning docket in front of him. Long night, Judge? She asked with a small smile. Calloway looked up at her. Marissa had been with him for 5 years, smart, efficient, and fiercely loyal. He wanted to believe she was clean. Something like that, he muttered. He flipped through the docket, but his mind wasn't on the cases. He was thinking about the phone call from Knox, about the way the crime boss had spoken to him like an equal, no, like a man who already knew the outcome of the game. Knox wasn't worried. And that meant he still had an ace up his sleeve. A message from the shadows. That night, Calloway drove home cautiously, scanning his mirrors for any sign of a tail. When he arrived, he checked the locks twice before stepping inside. Then he saw it. A single envelope sitting on his kitchen counter. His heart pounded. He had locked the doors. The windows were shut. There was no sign of forced entry. And yet, someone had been inside his house. Slowly, he picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside was a single slip of paper. Judges should know when to step down. Last warning. No name. No signature. Just a message. And Calloway knew exactly who had sent it. The FBI moves in. The next morning, he stormed into Lisa Carter's office, slamming the note onto her desk. Lisa raised an eyebrow. Well, that's subtle. Calloway clenched his fists. They were in my house, Carter. My house. Lisa leaned back in her chair, thinking. That means they're getting desperate. If Knox's people had real control over you, they wouldn't need threats. Calloway let out a dry laugh. Oh, that's comforting. Lisa sat up. Listen, Judge, this is what happens when you step into a war. You can still walk away. Calloway met her gaze. No, I can't. Lisa nodded, a hint of respect in her eyes. Good. Because we're about to hit them where it hurts. She slid another file across the desk. We found the connection. The federal judge working with Knox? His name is Judge Alan Whitaker. Calloway stiffened. He knew Whitaker, a respected, well-dressed man who had presided over major cases. A man everyone trusted. A man who was apparently on Knox's payroll. Lisa continued, Whitaker has been burying federal cases against Knox for years. Whenever we got close, he made sure the evidence disappeared. Delgado was just one of his pawns. Calloway exhaled sharply. So what's the plan? Lisa smirked. We set him up. The sting. Over the next week, Calloway played his part. He acted as if he had given in to Knox's warning. He ruled cautiously in court, kept his head down, and let the criminals believe he was done fighting. Meanwhile, Lisa's team worked in the background. They set up a fake case, one that looked like a new federal investigation into Knox's operations. Then, through carefully placed leaks, they made sure Whitaker got the information. And just as they predicted, Whitaker took the bait. A hidden wire caught him making a call. That new case against Knox? It needs to disappear. I don't care how you do it, just make sure it's dead before it reaches trial. It was enough. Lisa and her FBI team moved in. The next morning, as Judge Alan Whitaker sat in his chambers drinking his usual morning coffee, the door burst open. Alan Whitaker, Lisa Carter announced, flashing her badge. You're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy, and aiding an organized crime syndicate. Whitaker's face went pale. You can't do this. Lisa smirked. Watch me. The final move. That evening, Calloway sat in his chambers, watching the news as reporters swarmed the courthouse. Whitaker's arrest had sent shockwaves through the legal system. Brian Knox had lost his biggest protector. And Calloway? He had one. A knock at the door. Lisa stepped inside, her arms crossed. I thought you'd like to know, Knox just found out about Whitaker's arrest. Word is, he's not happy. Calloway smirked. Good. Lisa hesitated. This fight isn't over, you know. Knox still has people out there. And they will come after you. Calloway exhaled. He knew she was right. But for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. He stood up, straightening his tie. Let them try. Judge Calloway had spent his life enforcing the law, but now, for the first time, he was living in its shadows. After Judge Alan Whitaker's arrest, the justice system was in chaos. Investigations into his cases uncovered years of corruption, dismissed charges, fabricated evidence, and criminals walking free because they had the right connections. And Brian Knox? He was furious. Lisa Carter had warned Calloway that Knox's men would retaliate. But the first attack didn't come as a gunshot or a car bomb. It came as a legal assault. The counterattack. One morning, Calloway arrived at the courthouse to find a news crew waiting outside. Reporters swarmed him the moment he stepped out of his car. Judge Calloway. Any comment on the allegations? Do you deny accepting bribes? Will you resign? Calloway froze. What the hell are you talking about? A reporter shoved a document in his face. Judge Calloway under investigation for judicial misconduct. His blood ran cold. Knox was fighting back with paperwork. Inside the courthouse, his assistant Marissa Cole was already waiting with a stack of emails and phone calls from the Judicial Review Board. Judge, this isn't good, she said, eyes filled with concern. They're saying you interfered with Whitaker's cases, that you influenced rulings illegally. Calloway rubbed his temples. This is retaliation. Knox is pulling strings. Marissa hesitated. Then why does the complaint come from within the courthouse? Calloway's stomach dropped. Someone inside had filed the complaint. Another traitor. Lisa Carter arrived at his office minutes later, already aware of the situation. She tossed a folder onto his desk. "It's not just rumors," she said. "Knox's people got to someone in your court. They handed over evidence that you've been making biased rulings, working with the FBI for personal gain." Calloway scoffed. "That's ridiculous." Lisa crossed her arms. "It doesn't have to be true. It just has to be believable. Knox doesn't need to kill you if he can destroy your career instead." Calloway clenched his fists. "Who gave them the information?" Lisa hesitated. Then, with a sigh, she said the last name Calloway expected to hear. "Marissa Cole. His own assistant. The woman who had worked beside him for years." The betrayal stung worse than anything Knox could have thrown at him. The confrontation. That evening, Calloway sat in his office, waiting. At precisely 7 p.m., Marissa walked in, just like she had every night for years. But this time, her face was pale. "You know," Calloway said quietly. "It wasn't a question." Marissa swallowed. "Judge." "Don't," he interrupted. "Just tell me why." She looked down at her hands. "Knox's people came to me months ago. They knew about my brother." Calloway frowned. "Your brother?" Marissa's voice broke. "He's in prison, Judge. A Knox-owned prison. They told me if I didn't help, he'd disappear." Calloway exhaled slowly. Knox hadn't bribed her. He'd blackmailed her. "I didn't want to hurt you," Marissa whispered. "But they made me file the complaint. They gave me the documents. If I didn't do it, they would have killed him." Calloway leaned forward. "And now?" Marissa met his eyes, tears threatening to spill. "Now? I don't know." Lisa Carter stepped out of the shadows, where she had been silently listening. "Then let us handle it." Marissa flinched. "You don't understand. Knox has people everywhere." Lisa cut her off. "And we have federal power. If you help us, we can take Knox's people down. We can protect your brother. But if you don't, you'll go down with them." Marissa hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. The final move. 2 days later, the courtroom was packed. Judge Calloway sat at the bench, his hands steady despite the weight of the moment. Across from him sat Brian Knox, smug as ever in his designer suit, facing new charges based on fresh evidence. And beside him? His attorney, a last-minute addition to the case. Judge Alan Whitaker. Freshly released on bail, Whitaker had agreed to represent Knox, using his legal knowledge to twist the system in their favor. Calloway smirked. He had been expecting this. Lisa Carter sat in the gallery, giving Calloway the smallest nod. It was time. Calloway cleared his throat. "Before we proceed, there's been a new development in this case." Knox barely looked up. "Oh." Calloway's voice remained steady. "The prosecution has submitted new evidence, obtained from a cooperating witness." Knox's smile faltered. "What witness?" The doors to the courtroom swung open. Marissa Cole walked in. The room erupted in murmurs. Calloway leaned forward, watching as Knox's smug expression shattered. "You see," Calloway said, "turns out you do have people everywhere." "But so do we." Lisa Carter stood up. Your Honor, the prosecution would like to introduce recordings, conversations between the defendant and members of the judicial system, proving direct corruption, bribery, and intimidation. Whitaker turned pale. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Calloway cut him off. You would know, Whitaker. Lisa smirked. Oh, and Judge? There's one more thing. She turned to Knox. Your prison, the one you used to threaten Marissa's brother? The federal government just took it over. All your little deals? Gone. And your friends on the inside? They're flipping on you as we speak. Knox's face twisted in fury. Calloway sat back, enjoying the moment. For once, Brian Knox had no more moves left to play. Justice served. That night, Calloway and Lisa sat in his office, watching the news. Crime boss Brian Knox sentenced to life in federal prison. Lisa poured herself a drink. Hell of a ride, huh? Calloway exhaled. Yeah. She glanced at him. You sure you don't want to retire after this? Calloway chuckled. And let the next guy have all the fun? Lisa grinned. Fair point. For the first time in months, Judge Calloway felt like the law had truly won. And he wasn't going anywhere.